She sat at the table where her husband replaced her with another woman, and she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stood up, folded her napkin, and placed a sealed envelope on the table before walking away. What nobody in that room understood was this: every dollar in that empire, every offshore account, every legal shield protecting those dangerous men from federal prosecution, Serena Vale had built it, quietly, invisibly, for 8 years. They were about to find out what happens when the woman holding everything together finally lets go. If this story hits different, like the video, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this goes. The Sunday lunch always started the same way. 12:45, the Moretti Estate's iron gates would swing open with a sound like something giving up. The gravel driveway curved through manicured hedges trimmed to the exact height that Dominic Moretti, Lucian's father, had ordered in 1987. And nobody had ever adjusted them since because nobody dared suggest the old man's preferences were worth revisiting. 24 cars parked in neat rows alongside the east wall. Black sedans mostly. A few SUVs with tinted glass dark enough to qualify as a statement. The capos and their wives would file through the front entrance while the underbosses and advisors filtered around to the terrace entrance. A distinction that communicated exactly who ranked where without anyone ever having to say a word out loud. Serena knew every car by make, every face by name, age, and organizational position. She had been attending these lunches for 8 years, and she had spent the first 2 of them memorizing everything, because she understood early that the women in this world survived on information the way other people survived on food. She pulled her black Mercedes to a stop near the side entrance, turned off the ignition, and sat for 3 seconds with both hands still on the wheel. Not because she was nervous. She had graduated past nervous somewhere around year 3. She sat because the 3 seconds gave her what she privately called the reset, a moment to press the emotion down below where it showed, to arrange her face into the version of herself that the Moretti estate required. Composed, attentive, present but not intrusive. It was a performance she had refined to something close to muscle memory. She checked herself in the rearview mirror. Dark hair pulled back. A dark green dress that was elegant without demanding attention. Small diamond studs in her ears. Real, but modest. Lucien had given her a matched set of emerald earrings last Christmas, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a year, and she had thanked him and put them in the safe and worn the diamond studs because the emeralds said look at her in a room where being looked at too long meant being assessed, and she had spent 8 years being careful about what she invited. She got out of the car. Marco, the estate's head of security, nodded to her from the side entrance. He was a thick-shouldered man in his late 50s with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and eyes that were professionally absent of expression. But he always nodded to Serena first, before anyone else arrived, and she had always interpreted that as a kind of coded respect. The nod of a man who understood which people in any given organization were actually keeping things functional. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. "Marco." She paused. "How many today?" 31 confirmed. A beat. Plus a late addition. She registered the phrase but kept her face even. "Lucien's?" "Mr. Moretti's guest," Marco said, which was not the same as answering yes, but was not a denial either. His eyes moved to the gravel just briefly enough to tell her he wasn't going to say more. Serena walked inside. The dining hall in the Moretti estate was designed for a specific kind of authority. Long walnut table that seated 40. Crown molding. Portraits of Dominic Moretti and his 2 brothers along the east wall. Oil on canvas, rendered with the solemnity of men who had decided their legacy deserved that treatment. The chandelier was Venetian, real crystal, and it threw fractured light across the white tablecloth in a way that was genuinely beautiful and somehow also slightly threatening, the way a lot of things in this house were. Serena moved through the room the way she always did, purposeful but not rushed, speaking when spoken to, pausing to exchange a few words with Elena Caruso, whose husband ran the Moretti Logistics Network and who had been one of the first women in this world to treat Serena with something approaching genuine warmth. Elena was 62, broad-shouldered, with a pragmatist's eyes and a laugh that arrived without apology. "You look tired," Elena said quietly, leaning in under the noise of the room filling. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine." Elena's voice was not unkind. "I said you look tired." Serena allowed herself one honest second. "It's been a complicated week." Elena studied her for a moment with the focused attention of someone who had been watching this family long enough to know when complications had a specific shape. Then she patted Serena's arm once and moved away, and Serena kept her face composed and found her seat. She was 3 chairs down from the head of the table. Lucien's chair stood empty at the far end. It usually did until he made his entrance, because Lucien Moretti had understood since he was 22 years old that an entrance required a room already waiting for you. She took her seat, poured herself water from the crystal pitcher. Around her, conversations moved in the blended current of Sunday afternoon. Business veiled in casual language, old grievances dressed as jokes, loyalty tests conducted through the innocent-seeming medium of who laughed when. She participated where participation was required, and was quiet, where quiet served better, and she watched the door the way she had been watching doors for 8 years. Lucien came in at 1:15. She knew his walk before she saw his face. The particular sound of his Oxford shoes on hardwood, confident, unhurried, slightly wider stance than necessary, a walk that communicated, "I am not moving faster because I have nothing to prove to you." She had fallen in love with that walk once, the certainty of it. The way it seemed to suggest that a man who moved like that would always arrive exactly where he intended. She looked up. He was wearing the charcoal suit, the one she had taken to the tailor on 8th Avenue 8 months ago because the left shoulder seam had been pulling. The tailor had fixed it, and she had brought it home and hung it in his closet, and never mentioned it because that was the kind of thing she did without it becoming a transaction, without requiring acknowledgement, because she had believed for a very long time that this was what marriage meant, that you quietly tended to the small details of someone else's life as evidence of love. Standing beside him was a woman Serena had never seen. She was tall, blonde in the particular self-conscious way of someone who had chosen to be blonde rather than arrived there. A white dress, a specific and tactical choice for this room, this table, this occasion, because white in the Moretti dining hall was a declaration. She was perhaps 30, possibly younger, with the kind of composed beauty that had been carefully maintained through effort and attention, and she was holding Lucien's arm with a naturalness that told Serena this was not their first appearance together. They had practiced the casual. The room didn't go completely silent. It went to a different register of noise, that specific frequency of 30 people simultaneously adjusting their expressions and their conversations to process something unexpected without appearing to process anything at all. Lucien walked to the head of the table. Serena watched him cross the room. She watched him, and she let herself look, really look, at his face, because she needed to see whether there was hesitation there, whether there was a flicker of the man she had married somewhere in the set of his jaw, whether this was something that had arrived accidentally and would be explained in a way that made some difficult kind of sense. His jaw was not hesitating. He pulled out the chair beside his own, the chair that had been Serena's chair for 8 years, and held it out for the woman in white. "I want to introduce someone," Lucien said. His voice carried the full length of the table without effort. It always had. He placed one hand on the woman's shoulder. "Vivian Cross. She is a—" He paused, and the pause was deliberate. It was shaped. It had been thought about. "The woman who belongs beside me." The room became the kind of quiet that made the chandelier above sound like it was breathing. Serena did not move for 3 full seconds. She could feel the room orienting toward her. 31 pairs of eyes performing the social calculation of watching 2 things at once, Lucien and his new declaration at one end of the table, and Serena at the other end, waiting to see what Serena Vale Moretti would do when her husband publicly replaced her. This was the moment they had come to watch, whether they had known it before arriving or not. This was the scene. She picked up her water glass and took one slow sip. Then she set the glass down. Then she unfolded her napkin, the white linen napkin that one of the kitchen staff had placed at her setting with the same precision applied to every setting. And she refolded it carefully, pressed the crease flat with 2 fingers, and set it beside her plate. She stood, not fast, not with the sharp energy of someone reacting, with the steady, deliberate pace of a woman who had decided what she was going to do and was doing it. She did not look at Vivian Cross. She did not look at the faces turning toward her. She looked at Lucien, just for a moment, with an expression she kept completely empty, and what she saw back was something she had not expected. Not triumph, though there was something of that. Not cruelty, though there was something of that too. What she saw was a man who had made a decision he believed was irreversible, and had decided irreversibility was the same thing as strength. She bent, reached into her bag, and removed an envelope. It was standard size, white, sealed. Her name was not on it. Nothing was written on the outside. She set it on the table in the space her place setting had occupied. Then she walked the full length of the dining hall without adjusting her pace, past 31 people who had gone so quiet she could hear the chandelier crystals moving fractionally in the air circulation, past the oil portraits of Dominic Moretti and his brothers rendered in oils that cost more than most people's cars, past Marco standing at the side entrance with an expression that had finally cracked slightly from its professional blankness into something that looked like it hurt him. She pushed through the door. The gravel crunched under her heels. The afternoon was cold, the sky the white-gray of early March, no sun visible. The grounds of the estate laid out under that flat, colorless light that made everything look slightly posthumous. She found her car. She got in. She inserted the key. She sat there for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Her hands were on this wheel again, the same position as 45 minutes ago when she had sat in this exact seat running the reset on herself, pressing down what she felt so it wouldn't show. Now she sat in the same position and let herself feel every single thing she had refused to feel inside that room. And it arrived not as tears, her body seemed to have made some decision about tears, but as a physical weight, a compression in her sternum like something structural giving way. 8 years. Sunday lunches and estate dinners and financial meetings conducted at the edge of the legal world, and years of quiet work and patience, and the particular exhaustion of being genuinely essential to something that never once acknowledged your name. 8 years, and Lucien had walked into that room and placed another woman in her chair without the courtesy of a private conversation first. She started the engine. The gates opened before she reached them. Marco's doing, she understood, because the gate control panel was inside the security booth at the end of the drive, and Marco must have watched her from the estate entrance camera and done her the small dignity of not making her wait. She noted it, filed it in the place where she kept the things that mattered. She drove, not home. Not to the townhouse in the Moretti-adjacent neighborhood where she had arranged her life inside the life of this organization. She drove downtown, into the city's working core, because downtown was where her actual office was, the glass-walled suite on the 23rd floor of the Harrington building that had functioned as her professional headquarters for the past 4 years, the space where she had conducted the actual, substantive work of keeping the Moretti financial architecture intact, which was work that looked from the outside like consulting and accounting oversight and legal coordination, and was, from the inside, the complicated and relentless labor of making sure that an organization built on violence and profit and exposed legal liability didn't collapse under the weight of its own recklessness. She parked in the underground garage and took the elevator to 23. Her assistant, a sharp 26-year-old named Dara, looked up from her desk with immediate attention as Serena came through the glass doors. Dara had been with her for 2 years and had the rare quality of not asking questions she didn't need answers to. She looked at Serena's face briefly, professionally, and said, "Should I hold everything?" "No." "Get me Marcus Webb on the phone. Then call Hargrove's office and tell them I need to move our Tuesday meeting to tomorrow." Serena kept walking toward her office. "And get the current status report from the financial coordination team. I need the most recent one. The quarterly summary or the operational?" "The operational. The one with the liquidity positions." She reached her office door, pushed it open. "And Dara, nobody gets my number for the rest of today. That means nobody." She sat at her desk, and for a moment she didn't open anything or pick up a phone. She looked out the window at the city below, the particular mid-afternoon lull when the streets had cleared from the lunch rush but hadn't yet crowded with the late afternoon commute. That brief window where the city looked almost manageable. She thought about the envelope. She had written it 6 weeks ago. Not as a plan. She had not wanted this to be a plan, had not wanted to be the kind of woman who prepared for her own humiliation in advance, as if she'd expected it, as if she'd given up. But she was also a woman who understood risk management with a precision that most actuaries would respect, and somewhere in the territory of the past year, as Lucien's distance became architecture rather than weather, As specific expenses began appearing in financial records that he hadn't discussed with her, as two separate sources had separately used the word socialite in the same month in ways that were clearly not coincidental, somewhere in that accumulating evidence she had written the letter. Not as a threat. She had been careful about that. She was not a woman who made threats. Threats were the instrument of people who believed the other party needed to be frightened into compliance, and Serena didn't need to frighten anyone. She had built something that operated on a different principle entirely. The letter was a recitation of fact. It named the accounts, the offshore structures in the Cayman Islands and in Cyprus, the shell corporations that ran the legitimate business portfolio, the real estate holdings, the construction interests, the restaurant group that cleaned money with the practiced efficiency of a well-maintained machine. It named the cross-border agreements she had personally negotiated over 6 years with 2 different Swiss banking intermediaries. It named the restructuring arrangement she had engineered 18 months ago when the legitimate side of the empire had been 22 days away from a debt default that would have drawn federal attention to the entire financial architecture. And it stated in clear language that her continued involvement in maintaining those structures was contingent on conditions that the envelope itself made explicit. She was not the Moretti Syndicate's wife anymore. She had ceased to be, in any meaningful operational sense, the moment Lucien walked into that dining room with Vivian Cross on his arm. She was something else now. She was a creditor. Marcus Webb called back 12 minutes later. He was a criminal defense attorney of 61 years, silver-haired, with a voice like expensive furniture, and the kind of strategic intelligence that had kept him 3 steps ahead of federal prosecutors for 30 years. He was also the only person in the Moretti legal orbit who reported to Serena directly, a structural fact that Lucien had agreed to 7 years ago during a moment of financial crisis without fully absorbing what it meant. "You've seen it," Serena said. "I was in the room," Marcus said. A pause. The weight of a man deciding how honest to be. "I watched the whole thing." "Then you know what comes next." Another pause. "Serena, don't." The word was quiet but firm. "I'm not calling for that conversation. I need to know where we are on the Hendricks refinancing. That's still contingent on your signature authorization. Lucien's been trying to push it through without, but the Swiss side requires the co-signatory approval per the 2019 agreement. I'm aware of what the 2019 agreement requires. I wrote it." "Yes," Marcus said. "You did." She could hear him breathing on the other end, a man recalibrating. She had known Marcus Webb for 6 years, and she understood him reasonably well. His intelligence, his pragmatism, the way he moved through complex situations with the calculation of someone who always knew which way the exit was. He was now doing the thing he did when new information arrived that required significant structural adjustment. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. "Prepare a full review of every pending authorization that requires my co-signature." She opened her desk drawer and removed a legal pad. The physical act of writing helped her think. "I need the complete list by tomorrow morning. Every outstanding agreement, every pending transfer authorization, every refinancing that's sitting in a queue waiting on my approval." That's going to be a significant list." "I know how significant it is, Marcus." Silence on the line. Then, "And the Hendricks timeline. If you don't sign by the end of next week, the refinancing falls through and the construction subsidiary defaults on." "I know." "Lucien is going to—" "I know what Lucien is going to do," she said. "He's going to call me. He's going to call you. He's going to call everyone who's standing between him and those signatures. And I want every one of those calls documented. And I want the documentation preserved with your office, not with anyone associated with the Moretti estate." A longer pause. Marcus Webb processing what this actually was. "Serena," he said carefully, "are you sure about this?" She looked out the window again. The city was still sitting there, flat under the gray sky, patient and indifferent. "The question isn't whether I'm sure," she said. "The question is whether the organization can function without my cooperation." She let that land. "You already know the answer to that." She ended the call. Dara came in with the operational status report, 43 pages, printed, organized with Serena's specific indexing system. Serena took it, set it on the desk, and began reading from the 3rd section, which was where the liquidity position summary lived. She read with a red pen in her hand, circling numbers, marking pages with folded corners. The numbers told a story she had already known, but which was arriving now in sharp relief, with the clarity that comes when you stop trying to interpret data charitably and read it for what it actually says. Lucienne had been pulling cash from the legitimate subsidiaries for 14 months. Not dramatically, not in a way designed to trigger internal alerts. The amounts were calibrated to fall just below the thresholds that would require formal review. But accumulated over 14 months, the withdrawals represented a significant erosion of the liquidity reserve she had spent 3 years building. Money that had been earmarked as the buffer against exactly the kind of federal inquiry that became more likely every year had been quietly redirected into expenses that appeared in the documentation as operational costs, but which Serena, who understood the actual operational costs with meticulous precision, recognized as personal expenditure dressed in accounting language. Private travel, hospitality accounts, event arrangements, a residential property in Miami purchased through a subsidiary in a transaction she had never authorized. She closed the report. She sat with the flat sensation that settled in your chest when you looked directly at something you had already known and had been working very hard not to look at directly. Lucien had not merely replaced her at the dining table. He had been spending down the Empire's reserves for over a year, and the financial stabilization deal that had kept the whole architecture from federal exposure. The deal she had personally engineered at significant cost to herself, because it had required her to put her own financial credentials on the line, her own professional reputation as a guarantor. That deal was now sitting in a queue, waiting on her renewed authorization. Without it, the construction subsidiary defaulted. The default triggered a review clause in the banking agreement. The review clause opened the door to exactly the kind of examination that would peel back the surface of the legitimate business portfolio and find what was underneath. The envelope she had left on the dining room table contained, among other things, a concise explanation of all of this. She imagined it being opened, imagined the first underboss, probably Caruso, whose analytical instincts were sharper than Lucien gave him credit for, working through the letter's contents with the increasing attention of a man watching a building he owns begin to list at an angle that suggests structural failure. Imagine the questions arriving at Lucien's end of the table, the ones that couldn't be deflected by authority or presence alone because they were about numbers. And numbers had the specific quality of not caring who was in charge. Her phone lit up on the desk. She looked at it, Lucien's name on the screen. She had expected it to take longer. She let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Same name on the screen. She let it ring. She turned the phone face down on the desk and went back to the operational report. 2 floors below and across the city, she knew the Sunday lunch had devolved into something it was never meant to be. The food probably still sat on the table, untouched, or nearly so, because appetite was among the first things to go when an organization suddenly confronted the specific variety of crisis that couldn't be addressed through force or intimidation. You could not threaten a bank. You could not have a financial audit physically removed from a room. You could not shoot your way out of a debt covenant review. Vivian Cross was probably still in the room. Serena found that she felt nothing particular about Vivian Cross. Whatever that woman had understood herself to be walking into, the arm of a powerful man, a position of elevation, she had walked into a burning building without knowing it was burning. That was not Serena's cruelty. That was Lucy N's. At 4:30, Dara knocked on the office door. "Vincent Caruso is calling the main line," she said. "He says it's urgent. Tell him I'm in a meeting." "He said to tell you it's about the—" Dara glanced at a note. "The Hendricks authorization and the downstream agreements. He said you'd know what that means." "I do know what it means." Serena kept her pen moving on the legal pad. "Tell him I'll be in touch when I'm available." Dara hesitated at the door. Something behind her professionalism was asking a question she wasn't sure she was authorized to ask. "Dara." "Yes? I'm all right." Serena looked up briefly. "I'm not having a breakdown. I know what this looks like from your side, and I promise you it's not that." She returned to the page. "Set up the conference room for 8 tomorrow morning. I want the financial coordination team, Marcus Webb, and Catherine Hale from the banking side. Don't tell anyone else." "Yes." Dara moved to leave, then paused again. "Mrs. Moretti, should I—" "Vale," Serena said. Dara blinked. Going forward, Serena said, with the same even tone she used for all professional instructions. I'm Vale. Serena Vale. She circled a number on the legal pad. That's how I'll be introduced? That's how I'll sign documents? That's how this office represents me. She looked up once more. Please update everything accordingly. Dara stood at the door with the expression of someone processing a shift in geography. Not a small adjustment, but a full reorientation, the kind where the landmarks you'd been navigating by have moved. Then she nodded, with the quiet gravity the moment deserved, and said, Of course, Ms. Vale. After she left, Serena sat in the descending afternoon light and felt the name settle over her like a garment she'd been keeping in a closet for 8 years, something she'd bought for herself and then set aside because the life she was living hadn't had room for it. Serena Vale. The name she'd had before Lucy, Yen. Before the estate, and the Sunday lunches, and the emerald earrings in the safe, and the performance of composure practiced in rearview mirrors. The city outside was beginning its shift to early evening, office lights coming on in the surrounding towers. The particular quiet that preceded the rush. Her phone was still face down on the desk. She knew without checking that there were more calls, more voicemails. The messages would begin moving outward from Lucien through the organizational hierarchy, to Marcus, to Caruso, to the senior advisors who would be doing their own arithmetic right now, running their own calculations about what it meant that the woman whose signature was the final authorization on 12 outstanding financial agreements had just walked out of the Sunday lunch and turned her phone over. Tomorrow morning, the room would be full of people with questions. And for the first time in 8 years, every answer would belong to her. She turned to a clean page on the legal pad and began to write. At the top of the page, she wrote 2 words, My terms. Then she began. Across the city, in the dining room of the Moretti estate, Vincent Caruso was on his 3rd read of the letter Serena had left on the table. He had commandeered it from Lucien 2 hours ago, after Lucien had gone through the first phase, the anger, the commands, the phone calls that weren't being answered, and had moved into the particular stunned quality of a man who had done something irreversible and was beginning to understand what irreversible meant. Caruso was 57 years old. He had been with the Moretti organization since before Lucien was running it, had watched 2 financial crises and 1 federal investigation and a restructuring that should have destroyed them, and he had developed over those years a specific sensitivity to the feeling of ground shifting under his feet. He could feel it right now, not metaphorically. He could feel the actual temperature of the room, the way everyone in it was holding themselves slightly differently, the way conversations had gone to short sentences and careful eyes. He set the letter on the table. He looked at Lucien, who was standing at the window with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him, which was the posture Lucien defaulted to when he had no move available but needed to occupy space with the appearance of consideration. Lucien, Caruso said. Lucien didn't turn. Lucien. Firmer. I need you to look at what I'm holding. Lucien turned. His face had the particular set of a man who was choosing aggression as a substitute for clarity. I don't need to look at... The Hendricks deal collapses in 9 days without her signature, Caruso said. If it collapses, the construction subsidiary goes into default review. If the review opens, everything behind it, I know what's behind it. Then you know we have 9 days. Caruso placed the letter flat on the table and smoothed it with one hand. And she's not answering your calls. The room was quiet. Vivian Cross had been moved, gently but firmly, by one of the senior wives, to the sitting room down the hall, which was the organizational equivalent of a very polite removal from a conversation that had become structural. Lucien walked back to the table. He looked at the letter. His jaw was tight. His hands, when he placed them on the table surface, were not entirely steady. She wouldn't, he said, but the sentence had the structure of a man questioning rather than stating. She already has, Caruso said. She walked out. She's not answering. In 8 years, has she ever not answered? Silence. 8 years, Caruso said again, quieter. And you put another woman in her chair in front of 30 people. He didn't add without warning her, though the addition lived in the air between them. Did you think she was just going to absorb that? Lucien's hands pressed flat on the table. His eyes moved across the letter's contents again. The accounts, the structures, the authorization chains, the explicit recitation of what she had built and maintained and what required her continued cooperation. Reading it the way you read something that you don't want to be true but cannot find the error in. "Get her on the phone," he said. Not to Caruso, to the room, to anyone. Nobody moved immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "Get her on the phone," he said again, louder, and this time it had the edge of command, the tone he used when he needed to feel like he was still the one directing what happened next. Marco, standing near the door, said quietly, "Mr. Moretti, she left instructions that she's not taking calls." Lucien looked at him. "She left those instructions with my team," Marco said. Steady. "Before she left the grounds." The silence that followed had a texture to it. The specific texture of a room full of people realizing, at different speeds, that the woman they had spent 8 years cataloging as Lucien's wife had been operating this entire time with a precision and foresight that none of them had properly accounted for. Lucien stood at the head of the table where he had always stood. For the first time in the 8 years Caruso had watched him run this organization, Lucien Moretti looked like a man who had made a mistake he could not undo. And somewhere across the city, Serena Vale, not Moretti, Vale, was on a clean page of her legal pad, writing the terms under which the empire he had built on her foundation might, if he was very careful and very lucky, survive the next 30 days. The pen moved in clean, certain strokes. She had been building toward this without knowing she was building toward it, and now that she was here in this office, with this pen, with this page, she was not afraid. She was not even particularly angry, though the anger was there somewhere beneath the professional surface, compressed and patient. What she was, for the first time in a long time, was clear. The clarity of a woman who has been carrying something so long she forgot it was a choice, and who has finally set it down and is standing up straight for the first time in years, feeling the full height of herself. She wrote another line. Outside, the city had gone fully dark. The window reflected her back at herself. Composed face, pen in hand, lamp pooling yellow light across the desk. She looked at the reflection for a moment. Then she turned back to the page and kept writing. The legal pad had 14 pages of notes by the time Serena set the pen down. Not 14 pages of grievance. Not 14 pages of the kind of writing people do when they are trying to process pain by converting it into language. 14 pages of structured conditions, financial, operational, legal, organized with the same precision she brought to every significant document she had ever produced, which was the precision of someone who understood that emotions were real, but that vague emotions did not hold up in a room full of attorneys. She stacked the pages, aligned the edges, and set them face down on the desk. Then she sat back in her chair and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving the estate, to feel the full physical weight of the day. It arrived in her shoulders first, then the base of her skull. The particular exhaustion of sustained performance, 8 hours of keeping her face arranged correctly, of selecting words with the care of someone diffusing something, of being present in a room as a composed, professional, functional person, while something structural inside her was quietly giving way. She was tired, not broken. Tired. There was a difference, and she needed to hold on to it. She gathered the pages, locked them in her desk drawer, and left the office at 8:47. The building's garage was nearly empty at this hour, her heels on concrete the only sound. She drove home on autopilot, muscle memory navigating the route while some back portion of her brain continued running the calculations that never fully switched off. The 9-day window on the Hendricks authorization, the downstream defaults, the review clause, the exposure. She ate half a container of leftovers standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the dining table felt like too much ceremony for one person in an apartment she had been living in with increasing awareness of its loneliness for the past year. She drank 1 glass of water. She showered. She lay in bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling with the specific wakeful quality of a mind that had too many open threads to close. She was asleep by 10:15 because she was disciplined about sleep the way she was disciplined about most things. Not because she always wanted it, but because she understood that exhaustion made people imprecise, and she could not afford imprecision right now. She did not check her phone before sleeping. By morning, she had 41 missed calls. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched the city in its early state. The particular clarity of a March morning before the day had accumulated its noise, pale light on glass and concrete, a few early commuters moving on the sidewalk below. She looked at her phone for the first time, scrolled through the list with the detachment of someone reviewing data rather than personal communication. 22 from Lucian, 9 from numbers she recognized as estate adjacent, the organizational phones that various underbosses and senior associates used when calling outside the normal chain. 3 from Marcus Webb, which she had expected. 2 from a number she didn't recognize, which she would deal with separately. 1 from Elena Caruso, which she noted was something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. She called Marcus first at 7:12 while the coffee was still too hot to drink. He picked up on the first ring. "I was waiting," he said. "I know. What's the legal status on the Hendricks authorization? Specifically, is there any mechanism through which Lucien can proceed without my co-signature?" A pause. The kind that told her he had already looked into this. "I spent 3 hours on it last night." Another pause. "No, the 2019 agreement is binding on both signatories. Without your approval, the refinancing can't close. I checked with our contact at the Swiss intermediary. They won't move without the cosign. And Lucian's attorneys? Have they found anything?" "They're looking, but they're not going to find anything, Serena, because you drafted that agreement specifically to—" He stopped himself. "Specifically to require my continued participation," she said. "Yes. I know why I drafted it that way." She took her first sip of coffee. "I need you at the Harrington building at 8, conference room B. I'll be there. And Marcus, don't take any calls from the estate between now and then." A beat. "Serena, I'm not asking you to choose a side. I'm asking you not to have a conversation before we've had ours." She let that sit. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, with the weight of a man who understood exactly what the morning was going to require. She dressed. Dark navy, professional but not softened. She was not interested in being approachable today in the way she had spent years being approachable. She wore the diamond studs again. She took the emerald earrings out of the safe, looked at them for a moment, and put them back. She was in the conference room at 7:58. Marcus arrived at 8:04, carrying his leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had not slept well. He was followed 2 minutes later by Catherine Hale, the senior banking consultant who had been Serena's primary contact on the legitimate side of the Moretti financial portfolio for 5 years. A 54-year-old woman with the kind of careful composure that came from spending decades operating in rooms where people were always trying to figure out exactly how much you knew. Behind Catherine came 2 members of Serena's financial coordination team, both of whom had worked directly with her for years, and both of whom had the focused, slightly coiled energy of people who understood that something significant was happening and were here to be useful rather than informed. Serena didn't spend time on preamble. "The Hendricks refinancing closes or defaults in 9 days, she said. "The construction subsidiary's debt position is not survivable without the refinancing. If it defaults, the review clause in the primary banking agreement activates." She set a single printed page in the center of the table. A clean 1-page summary she had prepared at 6 this morning. "I have not authorized the refinancing. I am not going to authorize the refinancing on the current terms. What I need from this room is a full picture of every pending authorization that flows through my approvals, so that I can determine the sequence and the timeline." Catherine Hale picked up the summary page. "Read it. Set it down. Are you restructuring your involvement?" "I'm redefining my involvement," Serena said. "There's a distinction. The syndicate's exposure if this defaults—" "I know the exposure, Catherine. I modeled it." Serena's voice was level. "I need the banking side's read on the review clause specifically. If the review opens, how fast does it move?" Catherine and Marcus exchanged a look that lasted about a half-second, the compressed communication of 2 professionals processing the same new reality from different angles. "Faster than Lucien will want," Catherine said, which was not a complete answer, but was an honest one. "How fast?" 72 hours for the preliminary review. If they find anything worth examining in the preliminary—" She opened her own folder, pulled a page. "The full audit can be compelled within 30 days. Serena wrote the number on her pad. "And the audit scope. Does it stop at the construction subsidiary or does it extend to the parent structure?" "It extends," Catherine said quietly. Per the covenant language, it extends to all entities under the primary guarantor structure, which meant everything, which meant the whole architecture, the shell corporations, the real estate holdings, the restaurant group, the offshore positions, the cleaned and recleaned capital that funded the legitimate empire's surface. All of it, exposed to the kind of examination that federal involvement would eventually follow if the right numbers caught the wrong eyes. This was the mathematics of what Lucien had done. Not the personal mathematics, the humiliation, the 8 years, the other woman in her chair, but the organizational mathematics. He had spent down the reserves that made the empire resilient. He had ignored her repeated warnings about the liquidity position. He had walked into a Sunday lunch and replaced the person whose signature was the last line of defense between his empire and its exposure, without apparently considering what that person might do when she left. She understood, sitting in this conference room, that this was not malice on his part. Malice would have required him to have understood her role fully enough to calculate the consequences of removing her. What it actually was something worse. He had simply never believed, despite everything, that she was as essential as she was. He had watched her work for 8 years and had absorbed the results without absorbing what produced them. He thought the empire ran because he ran it. She let that thought move through her and then she set it aside, because the conference room required her, not her thoughts about Lucien. "Marcus," she said, "the authorization list." He opened his briefcase, removed a document that was, as he had predicted, significant. 38 pending items requiring her co-signature, ranging from routine renewals to 3 large transactions that were actively time-sensitive. She worked through the list for 90 minutes, categorized, prioritized, asked precise questions, got precise answers. Her financial coordination team cross-referenced positions against the operational status report from the previous day. Catherine provided the banking context. Marcus provided the legal framing. By 9:45, she had a clear picture. The empire was more vulnerable than even she had fully accounted for. The 14 months of reserve erosion had left thinner margins than her most recent models had projected, which meant Lucien had been drawing down faster in the final months than the pattern had suggested. The Hendricks default was not the only time-sensitive pressure. There were 2 other positions that would create serious problems within 30 days if she suspended her involvement entirely. She was not going to suspend her involvement entirely. She was not interested in destroying the organization. She was not interested in the kind of scorched earth action that would expose 30 people, some of whom she respected, some of whom had nothing to do with what Lucien had done, to federal consequences. What she wanted was different. What she wanted was recognition. Formal, documented, organizational recognition of what she had built and what she had protected. Independence from the estate's operational control, financial separation, and conditions that made a resumption of her participation contingent on structural changes that would prevent the reserves from being depleted again by personal expenditure dressed as operational cost. She was explaining this, calmly, precisely, when Dara knocked on the conference room glass. Serena looked up. Dara mouthed one word through the glass. Caruso. Not Lucien. Caruso. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway. Dara handed her the phone without commentary. "Mr. Caruso," she said. "Serena." Vincent Caruso's voice was the voice of a man who had been up all night and had landed, through exhaustion and calculation, somewhere in the territory of honesty. No warmth, no performance. "I need to see you." "I'm in a meeting." "I know. That's why I called instead of coming to the building." A pause. "I've been through the letter, I've been through the financials, I've talked to 3 of the senior underbosses and 2 of the legal team." Another pause, the kind that carried weight. "Lucien doesn't know I'm calling you." She stood in the hallway with the phone against her ear and let the silence do what it needed to do. "I'm not calling for Lucien," Caruso said. "I'm calling for the organization." "Those used to be the same thing," she said. "Yeah," he said. "They did." He breathed through the phone. "Can we meet?" "Today." "Not the estate. Wherever you want." She thought for a moment. "The Harrington lobby, 2 o'clock." "I'll be there." She went back into the conference room, finished the meeting, sent Marcus and Catherine away with specific tasks and specific timelines, sat alone for a few minutes after they left, looking at the authorization list, running the 9-day calculation again in her head. She thought about calling Elena Caruso back. Elena's call last night, not Vincent's official call, but Elena's personal one, had a different texture. Elena had been in that dining room. Elena had seen Serena's face and then seen the envelope and then watched the whole sequence of the afternoon unravel in real time. Her call might have been a wife checking on someone, or it might have been a woman who had been in this world for 30 years, doing the thing that women in this world sometimes did when they understood the actual shape of what was happening, bearing witness. She didn't call Elena back yet. She would, but not yet. At 2 o'clock, Vincent Caruso walked into the Harrington lobby wearing a gray suit that looked like he'd put it on at 3 in the morning and hadn't taken it off. He was a big man. Broad shoulders, the remnant physicality of someone who had been genuinely dangerous in his younger years. But he moved today with the slightly compressed quality of someone carrying a weight that wasn't evenly distributed. He spotted her near the far seating area, crossed the lobby without stopping to check the room the way he normally did, which told her something about his state. He sat down, looked at her directly, which she appreciated. "How bad is it?" she said, because the time for softening the question was over. "Bad," he said. "No decoration." The underbosses spent the night with the numbers. By this morning, 3 of them had come to me independently. He picked up the coffee she'd ordered for him without asking if he wanted it, drank from it. Nobody knew. That's what they keep saying. Nobody knew it was this much. That the whole thing was this. He searched for the word. "Contingent," she said. "Contingent." He repeated it with the flatness of someone accepting a verdict. "On you." "It was always contingent on the work," she said. "I happened to be doing the work." He looked at her for a moment with the specific look of a man who understood that there was a distinction in what she had just said and was deciding whether he had the right to address it. Then he said, 8 years, Serena. 8 years and nobody... Don't. Her voice was even, but the words stopped him. "I don't want the apology version of this conversation. I've had 8 years of that conversation in my head, and I know how it ends." She set her coffee down. "Tell me where Lucian is." Caruso's jaw moved. "He's at the estate. He's..." A breath. "He's not in a good place. I need him to understand something," she said. "And I need you to understand it so that it reaches him correctly." She met his eyes. "I am not doing this to destroy the organization. I am not doing this out of anger, though I have a considerable amount of it, which is my right." She let that sit for a moment. "I am doing this because the organization's current structure allows one person to make decisions that endanger everyone, with no accountability and no check. That needs to change before I put my name on anything else." Caruso was quiet. "The conditions in the letter," she said. "They're not punitive, they're structural. Independent financial oversight, separation of personal expenditure from organizational accounts, formal documentation of my role." She looked at him. "Those are reasonable conditions for anyone who spent 8 years doing what I did." "The underbosses," he started. "The underbosses should have asked better questions 3 years ago," she said, with a precision that was not cruel but did not allow for comfort. "Where were they when the reserves started moving? Where were they when the Miami property went through a subsidiary with no authorization?" Caruso's expression shifted, something in it going still in the particular way of a man hearing a specific detail for the first time. "The Miami property is in the letter." She tilted her head slightly. "Which means you haven't finished the letter." He had the honesty to look briefly uncomfortable. There's a lot in the letter." "Yes," she said. "There is." She picked up her coffee. "Finish reading it, Vincent. Then tell the underbosses to finish reading it, because when they do, their question won't be whether to accept my conditions." She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has finished being surprised by what she knows and has started simply using it. Their question will be how fast. Caruso sat with that. The lobby moved around them, people crossing with briefcases, a phone ringing at the concierge desk, the ambient sound of a building full of people conducting ordinary business. Normal world, running on its normal axis, indifferent to the conversation happening in its lobby. "Lucien is going to fight this," Caruso said. "Not as a threat, as information." "I know," she said. "He fights everything he doesn't control." She looked out through the lobby's glass front at the street. "But he doesn't control this, and somewhere under the anger he knows it." She stood, picked up her bag. Tell him I'll accept one phone call. One, and it has to be tonight. After that, everything goes through attorneys. Caruso stood. And if he won't, he will, she said, because the alternative is watching the whole thing collapse. And whatever else Lucien Moretti is, he is not a man who accepts collapse. She held Caruso's gaze. Tell him 8 o'clock. I'll pick up. She left him standing in the lobby. She was 4 steps from the elevator when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. From the unknown number she had logged that morning, she opened it in the elevator. You don't know who I am yet. But I know who you are, Ms. Vale. I've known for a long time. We should talk before tonight. D. She read it twice. Felt the specific quality of new information arriving with a shape she didn't yet recognize. Not threatening, not warm, just present in the way of something that had been moving toward her from a distance she hadn't been watching. She looked at the text for 10 more seconds while the elevator climbed. Then she typed, "Who is D?" The response came back in under a minute. Someone who has been watching the Moretti accounts from the outside for 4 years. Someone who knows that the reserve erosion started 8 months before Lucien told you it did. The elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor. Serena stood in the opening for a moment, the doors trying to close and bumping gently against her before she stepped out. 8 months before Lucien told you it did. She had built her timeline from the internal data, the data she had access to, the data that flowed through her coordination with Marcus and Catherine and the financial team. She had clocked the reserve erosion beginning 14 months ago because that was the earliest anomaly visible in the record she reviewed. If the erosion began 22 months ago, if someone had been moving capital before the period she had been tracking, then what she was looking at was not a man who had made reckless personal decisions with organizational funds. What she was looking at was deliberate concealment, which was a different problem entirely. She walked to her office, sat at her desk, looked at the phone in her hand. She typed, "When and where?" The response came immediately. "Tonight. Before your 8 o'clock. There's a coffee place on Reed Street. Marin's, 6:30. Come alone." She set the phone down on the desk. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that made the surface of her desk look like it was illuminated from below. Every paper, every pen, every object thrown into sharp relief, shadow and light, with no middle register. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she thought she knew. She thought about the 22-month number and what it meant if it was true. And she thought about the fact that 8 years of working inside the Moretti organization had given her very good instincts about when new information was a door and when it was a trap. This felt like a door. She didn't know yet what was on the other side of it. She picked up her pen, turned to a new page of the legal pad, wrote the number at the top, 22 months. And below it, in the methodical way she organized everything that mattered. What was he hiding? From whom? And for how long? The pen was still in her hand when her office phone rang. The desk line, not the cell, which meant it was being routed through the building's main system. She answered. "Ms. Vale," said a voice she did not recognize. Male, measured. The particular precision of someone who chose every word the way you chose which door to open in an unfamiliar building. "My name is Agent Colum Rafferty. I'm with the Financial Crimes Division." A pause. Not dramatic, just informational. "I wonder if you have some time this week to have a conversation." The afternoon light on her desk held everything in sharp relief. She didn't move, didn't change her breathing, held the phone against her ear with the same steadiness she had held everything today, because the distance between composure and collapse was a decision, and she had been making that decision, consciously, every hour of this day. "That depends," she said, in the same level voice she used for all professional conversations. "On what you want to talk about." "The Moretti financial structure," Rafferty said. "Specifically, the parts of it you built." She did not answer Agent Rafferty's question immediately. The pause was not hesitation. It was the 3 seconds she needed to map what she was standing inside. Not the full map. She didn't have that yet. But enough of the perimeter to know which direction was which. The Financial Crimes Division. The parts of it you built. Phrasing that careful, that precise, did not arrive by accident. Rafferty had constructed that sentence the way someone constructs a room, knowing exactly where the exits were before he invited her in. "I'll need to consult with my attorney before any formal conversation," she said. "That's standard." Of course, Rafferty said, with the ease of a man who had expected that answer. I want to be clear. This isn't a compelled interview. I'm asking for a voluntary conversation. Another pause. We're at an early stage, Ms. Vale. Early enough that the conversation could be useful for everyone. Early stage was a phrase that meant several different things depending on where you were standing when you heard it. She filed it. I'll have my attorney contact your office, she said. What's the best number? He gave her a direct line. She wrote it on the legal pad beneath the number 22, beneath the words, what was he hiding? From whom? And for how long? She thanked him with the same professional neutrality she had used throughout and ended the call. Then she sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. The Financial Crimes Division. 4 years of watching the Moretti accounts from the outside, the unknown contact had said. An agent calling not with a subpoena, but with an invitation, which meant either they didn't have enough yet to compel her, or they had enough and were offering her a choice about which side of the table she wanted to be on when the full weight of it arrived. She called Marcus Webb. He picked up on the second ring. She told him about the call in 3 sentences. Name, division, what he'd said. She heard the quality of Marcus's silence change in the way that told her he was processing something more complicated than she had given him. Marcus, she said, is there something you need to tell me? A breath. How long has Rafferty been in contact? This was the first call. She kept her voice even. Has he contacted the Moretti legal team? Not that I've been told. But the way he said it carried the specific weight of a man distinguishing between what he'd been told and what he knew. Marcus, she put both forearms on the desk. I need you to tell me everything you know about a federal interest in the Moretti financial structure, not what you've been authorized to tell me, what you know. The silence that followed was 8 seconds long. She counted. Come to my office, he said. Not the phone. She was there in 20 minutes. Marcus Webb's office was on the 15th floor of a building 6 blocks from the Harrington. Dark wood, law books that were genuine rather than decorative, a desk that was organized with the controlled disorder of a man who worked at a high volume, and had developed a system that looked like chaos only to people who weren't him. He was standing when she came in, which was unusual. Marcus Webb sat for everything, sat through difficult conversations the way a person sits through weather. He closed the door, gestured to the chair across his desk. She sat. He sat. He put both hands flat on the desk and looked at her with the expression of a man about to do something that cost him something. 4 months ago, he said, I received a proffer inquiry from a federal attorney, not Rafferty. A different office, different division. They were looking at the offshore structures, the Cyprus position specifically. He held her eyes. They had account numbers, Serena. Specific numbers. That level of specificity doesn't come from surveillance. It comes from someone who had direct access. She heard the words and felt the specific quality of a floor shifting. Not collapsing, not yet, but the sensation of structural integrity becoming a question rather than a given. You didn't tell me, she said. I was told, advised, that disclosure would compromise an ongoing matter. He paused. By Lucien, through the estate's legal team. His jaw was tight. I want you to know that I've been... Who gave them the account numbers, she said. The question was quiet. It arrived with the stillness of something she already suspected and was asking anyway, because she needed to hear it said in a room with another person present. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. We don't know for certain, he said. Who do you suspect? The pattern of what they have... He stopped, started again. The Cyprus positions were restructured 18 months ago. You handled that restructuring, but the specific account numbers they referenced in the proffer inquiry, those numbers were only distributed to 3 people in the original restructuring documentation. He paused. You, me, and the estate's primary financial coordinator. She was quiet. Dominic Reyes, she said. Not a question. Marcus's hands pressed harder against the desk. We don't know... Dominic Reyes has been Lucien's financial coordinator for 6 years, she said. Her voice had the flat quality of something being stated for the record rather than processed in real time. He reports directly to Lucien. He has access to every internal account structure. She looked at Marcus. and he's been in the room for every significant financial conversation I've had with the estate for 3 years. Serena, how long has Lucian known about the federal inquiry? Marcus was quiet for 2 seconds too long. Marcus. The estate's legal team was first approached 7 months ago, he said. It came out with the difficulty of something being extracted rather than offered. A preliminary inquiry, Lucien was informed. 7 months ago. 7 months ago, Lucien had known that federal investigators had specific account numbers from the Cyprus positions. Account numbers that had only been distributed to 3 people. And for 7 months, he had not told her. He had not told her while she continued managing those accounts, while she continued putting her name on documentation associated with those accounts. While she had, 6 months ago, signed a renewal authorization on the Cyprus structure that maintained her position as co-signatory. She stood up. The movement was controlled, but it came from somewhere physical, the body's response to what the mind was starting to understand. She walked 2 steps to the window that looked out onto the street below and stood there with her back to Marcus for a moment, one hand on the glass, not looking at anything in particular, looking at the cold truth of what she was now inside. Lucien had known that the accounts were being examined. He had known that someone with internal access had provided specific information to federal investigators. He had known his own financial coordinator was potentially the source. And he had said nothing to Serena, had allowed her to continue signing documents, continue authorizing transactions, continue putting her professional and legal identity on the line for a structure that was already compromised. And then, 7 months in, he had walked into a Sunday lunch and replaced her in front of 30 people. She pressed her palm harder against the glass. The 22 months. The unknown contacts text. 8 months before Lucien told you it did. The reserve erosion hadn't started 14 months ago. It had started 22 months ago, which placed its beginning 2 months before the federal preliminary inquiry, which meant the capital movement wasn't just reckless personal spending. It was the systematic movement of accessible funds before an investigation could freeze them, leaving the exposed structures, the ones bearing her co-signature, as the forward-facing architecture while the actual liquid capital moved somewhere else. He was moving money, she said. Still at the window, her voice was extraordinarily level. Before the inquiry, he knew they were coming. Someone told him, or he found out, or he had enough contact with Reyes to understand what Reyes was doing, and he started moving the accessible capital before it could be frozen. She turned from the window, and he left my name on the structures he expected to be examined. The silence in the room had the specific weight of a truth that has been spoken for the first time in a space where someone actually heard it. Marcus Webb looked at her with the expression of a man who had been living adjacent to this knowledge for months, and had been telling himself the story was different from the one she had just told. "We don't have direct evidence," he started. "Stop." She came back to the chair, sat down, put both hands flat on the desk, mirroring his earlier posture. "Don't manage me, Marcus. You've been managing me. You've been managing this information for 4 months and managing me, and I understand why you felt you had to, but that ends right now." She looked at him directly. "Give me everything. Every document, every correspondence, every note from the proffer inquiry, every piece of information that came through your office related to the federal interest in the Moretti structure. I want it today." He was quiet. "I'm on those accounts," she said. "My name is on those authorizations. My professional credentials are the guarantee on the Cyprus restructuring. If this goes where I think it's going, I am not a witness in this situation. I am a target." She held his eyes without blinking. "And you have been my attorney for 6 years, which means you have been sitting on information that directly affects my legal exposure for 4 months without telling me." Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. "How would you like to continue this relationship?" The clock on Marcus's desk made its small sound, a car horn from the street below, the ambient pressure of a building full of people going about their afternoon. Marcus Webb reached into his desk drawer and removed a folder. He set it on the desk in front of her. She opened it. It took her 40 minutes to read through the contents. Marcus sat across from her and did not speak, which was the right decision. The proffer inquiry documentation, the correspondence between the estate's legal team and the federal attorney. A summary memo written by someone in the estate's legal team that referred to the Cyprus positions in language that made clear they had known the exposure was specific, and that the co-signatory, not named directly, but described in terms that were only applicable to one person, was the legal vulnerability being managed around rather than protected. Being managed around. She read that phrase twice. She closed the folder. She looked at Marcus Webb with the particular clarity that arrives when you have been shown the full shape of something that you have been living inside without knowing its dimensions. "I need to make a call," she said. Privately. Marcus stood without a word and left his own office. She heard him close the door. She took out her phone and called the unknown number. It rang twice. "Ms. Vale," said the voice from the text. Measured, careful, that same quality of selected words. "Who are you?" she said. Not the question she texted earlier, the real one. "My name is Daniel Cho," he said. "I'm a forensic accountant. 18 months ago, I was hired by a private party to examine anomalies in the Moretti investment portfolio, specifically the movement of capital through the subsidiary structure in the 18 months prior." A pause. "I found what I found. I tried to bring it to the estate through proper channels. 6 weeks later, I was informed my contract was terminated." Another pause. 3 weeks after that, someone accessed my personal financial records and flagged 2 transactions that looked, with the right framing, like I had received improper payments." She sat with that. "Someone made you look compromised." "Someone made me look like the leak," he said, "so that when I tried to bring what I knew to anyone outside the organization, I would arrive already discredited." A beat. "The person who terminated my contract and the person who flagged my financial records were both acting on instructions from the same source." He paused. "I have documentation." "Who?" she said. "Dominic Reyes," he said. "But Reyes doesn't make that call independently. He has never made any significant call independently." Another pause, shaped like something that was going to hurt. "You know who made that call." She knew. She sat in Marcus Webb's chair in Marcus Webb's office, with the folder in front of her, and she let herself know it fully. Not the managed, negotiated version of knowing that she had been constructing for months as the evidence accumulated, but the complete knowledge, without softening, without the interpretive charity she had extended because extended charity was what you did when you were trying to preserve something you had built your life around. Lucien hadn't merely humiliated her at a Sunday lunch. He hadn't merely spent down the reserves or ignored her warnings or replaced her in front of 30 people. He had, with deliberate and calculated intent, positioned her as the visible architecture of a financial structure he expected to come under federal examination while moving the actual capital to safety. He had used her name, her credentials, her professional reputation, and her legal identity as a buffer. A front. A face to present to investigators while the money moved elsewhere. And when the investigation had started moving, when Reyes had confirmed the inquiry was becoming more serious, Lucien had walked into the Sunday lunch and created a public record of their separation. A dated, witnessed, organizationally documented moment of rupture, so that when the federal question arrived, "Why is Serena Vale's name on these accounts?" the answer available in the record was, "We were estranged, she was acting independently, I had no oversight of her decisions." He had not replaced her with Vivian Cross because he wanted Vivian Cross. He had replaced her publicly because he needed the record to show she was no longer under his protection. The room was very quiet. She sat in the chair for 60 seconds and did not move and did not make a sound and felt what she felt. The full catastrophic weight of it. The 8-year retrospective. The way every act of loyalty and labor and quiet competence now arranged itself in a different pattern than the one she'd been reading. The way the floor of the last 8 years had just shown her its actual material. And then she put it somewhere interior and deep, and she stood up and she opened the office door. Marcus was in the hallway. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there was enough to make him straighten. "I need 3 things," she said. "I need every document in that folder digitized and held outside any system accessible to the Moretti organization or its attorneys. I need Catherine Hale told that the authorization timeline may need to change, and I need you to understand that your obligation going forward is to me, not to the estate, because if you cannot make that commitment clearly right now, I need a different attorney before tonight." You have my commitment, Marcus said without hesitation, which was the first uncomplicated thing anyone had given her today. Good. She checked her watch. It was 4:47. I need to make a stop before 6:30. She started for the elevator. Don't contact the estate until you hear from me. She left the building and walked rather than drove, because she needed the cold air and the movement, needed her body doing something physical while her mind worked through the new architecture of what she was inside. The street was the ordinary street of a Tuesday afternoon. People in coats, a coffee cart, a bus displacing air as it passed. And she moved through it with the particular contained energy of someone who has received devastating information and is converting it, in real time, from devastation into direction. She needed to think about what she had and what it could do. She had Marcus and the documentation from his files. She had Daniel Cho and whatever he was carrying. She had Catherine Hale's banking expertise and her understanding of the account structures. She had her own knowledge. 8 years of intimate, comprehensive knowledge of every agreement, every authorization, every financial decision that had flowed through her desk, which was, she understood now, the most significant asset in the room. She also had Agent Rafferty's phone number and his careful, pointed invitation to a voluntary conversation. What she did not have was time. The 9-day Hendricks window was still running. The federal inquiry was at a stage that could move faster than she had accounted for. And tonight, at 8 o'clock, she had agreed to take one phone call from Lucien Moretti. A phone call she had agreed to before she had read the contents of Marcus's folder, before she had understood what the Sunday lunch was actually for. She walked for 6 blocks before she stopped at a corner and stood with her hands in her coat pockets and made the decision. She was not going to take the 8 o'clock call. Not because she was afraid of it, because she understood now that the call was another piece of the same structure. Lucien looking for a phone conversation that he could shape, that he could use to reconstruct a version of events in which she was a participant rather than a victim, in which her continued involvement in the organization's financial structures was the product of her ongoing choice rather than his ongoing exploitation of her position. Every conversation she had with Lucien now happened inside the potential hearing of a federal investigation. And she was not going to walk into that room without knowing exactly what the federal investigation had and exactly what it didn't. She pulled out her phone and texted Daniel Cho. I'll be at Marin's at 6:15. I need everything you have. She put the phone away and started walking again. Around her, the city moved in its indifferent way. Thousands of people in the middle of thousands of ordinary afternoons. None of them carrying what she was carrying. None of them walking toward a 6:30 meeting in a coffee shop on Reed Street that was going to determine whether the next chapter of her life was defined by what she built or what she survived. She had 1 block left before the turn for Reed Street when her phone buzzed. Not a text. A call. Lucien's name on the screen. 4 hours early. She looked at the phone, looked at the street ahead, felt the particular cold clarity of someone standing at an actual threshold, not a metaphorical one, and understanding which direction they were about to move. She pressed decline. The phone went dark. She turned the corner onto Reed Street and kept walking, and what she felt in her chest was not relief and was not grief. It was the specific hard feeling of a woman who has finally understood the full shape of what was done to her, who is still standing inside it, who has not yet found her way out, but who has just made the decision that she is not going to pretend anymore that any part of this was anything other than what it... Daniel Cho was already at Marin's when she arrived. He was sitting at the back corner table, the one with sightlines to both the door and the street window, which told her he had chosen it deliberately, which told her he was a man who had spent the last 18 months being careful about where he sat. He was Korean-American, mid-40s, with the particular physical compression of someone who had been carrying sustained stress for a long time. Shoulders slightly forward, eyes that moved to the door when she came in, and then did a quick sweep of the room behind her before settling. He had a laptop open and a coffee he hadn't touched. She sat across from him without taking off her coat. "You have documentation," she said. He turned the laptop to face her. What she looked at for the next 22 minutes was the forensic accounting record of a systematic deception. Cho walked her through it with the compressed efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this presentation many times in the expectation of an audience that might finally be in a position to do something with it. The Capital Movement timeline beginning 22 months ago, she saw the exact dates, the exact amounts, The transfer chains moving funds through 3 subsidiary layers before landing in structures that had no connection to the accounts bearing her name. The internal authorization records that showed Dominic Reyes signing off on transfers using approval codes that, according to the organizational chart, should have required her co-signature but had been routed through an alternate authorization pathway she had never been told existed. An alternate pathway. Built into the structure 6 years ago, documented in internal records she had never been given access to, used exclusively for transfers that Lucian and Reyes wanted moved without her knowledge. She had thought she knew the architecture completely. She had built most of it. She had believed the parts she hadn't built were the parts that didn't exist. This pathway, she said, pointing to the screen. When was it created? 6 years ago, Cho said, 2 months after you were brought into the financial coordination role formally. He looked at her steadily. It was created specifically to route around your visibility. 2 months after she was brought in. When Lucien had seen how thoroughly she understood the structures, how quickly she mapped the exposure points, how precisely she could identify risk, he had brought her in, recognized what she was, and immediately built a bypass around her so that what she saw was never the complete picture. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. The federal inquiry, she said. What do they have? They have the Cyprus account numbers and partial transfer records from the top layer of the subsidiary structure. Cho turned the laptop back toward himself. They don't have the alternate pathway documentation. They don't have the full capital movement timeline. What they have points toward you as the primary financial architect, because you are the name on the visible structures, without showing them what's underneath. He paused. If you walk into a voluntary conversation with Rafferty right now, you walk in looking like the center of this. And if I bring them what you have, then the picture changes completely. He said it without drama. Then you're not the architect. You're the front. She looked at him. Why are you bringing this to me? Because they made me look like the leak, he said. And the only way to clear that is to give the actual picture to someone who can do something with it. And the only person positioned to do something with it, he looked at her steadily, is you. She thought for a moment. The documentation, is it legally obtained? Every piece of it was part of my contracted scope of work, he said. I was hired to examine anomalies in the investment portfolio. These are anomalies in the investment portfolio. A beat. My attorney has reviewed the acquisition method. It's clean. She stood. Send everything to Marcus Webb's secure server. I'll give you the address. She buttoned her coat. Don't contact me again through the cell number. I'll have Dara set up a secure channel. She left Marin's at 6:58. The walk back to the Harrington building took 11 minutes. She used them. By the time she pushed through the lobby doors, her mind had done the thing it did when she gave it sufficient pressure and sufficient data. It had organized. The shape of the next 18 hours had arranged itself with the cold precision of a financial model, each step dependent on the previous, each action timed to produce the maximum leverage at the moment of maximum consequence. She called Marcus from the elevator. Change of plans, she said. I need the conference room for tomorrow, but not 8 o'clock, 7 a.m. And I need Agent Rafferty's direct number pulled up when I arrive. She stepped out onto 23. And Marcus, I need you to call Catherine Hale tonight. Tell her the Hendricks authorization is going to move, but not on the original terms. Tell her I need the restructured agreement ready for tomorrow morning. Serena. Marcus's voice had the quality of someone trying to keep up. What happened in the last 2 hours? I found out what actually happened, she said. I'll explain everything at 7. She did not take Lucien's second call, which came at 8:04. She did not take his third at 8:47. She sat in her office until 10:15, working through documents, drafting the outline of what she was going to say to Rafferty, mapping the evidentiary sequence with the care she brought to every significant argument she had ever constructed. Then she went home, ate something, and slept 6 hours with the focused intention of someone conserving resources for a specific expenditure. She was in the conference room at 6:53 the next morning when her phone rang. Not Lucien. Caruso. She answered. Vincent. He knows about Cho. Caruso's voice was tight, airless, the voice of a man making a call he was not authorized to make and doing it anyway. Someone told him last night that you met with Cho. He knows what Cho has. She felt the information arrive and absorbed it without visible reaction, though she was alone in the room. Who told him? I don't know. A breath. But, Serena, he's not handling it the way I expected. He's not trying to reach you anymore. Caruso paused. He's called the estate's containment attorneys. The ones they use for... He stopped. She understood what the containment attorneys were used for. She had known about them for 6 years. Is he moving to discredit the documentation? She said. I don't know what he's moving to do. I just know the calls started last night, and by this morning, the senior legal team was at the estate. His voice dropped. Serena, be careful today. She thanked him and ended the call. She sat for 30 seconds with her hands flat on the conference table and let the new variables settle into the model. Lucien knew she had the Cho documentation. Lucien had called his containment attorneys, which meant he was not going to wait for her to walk into a conversation with federal investigators. He was going to move to preempt it, to discredit the documentation, or discredit Cho, or discredit her before she could weaponize what she knew. She had less time than she had calculated. She called Marcus. How soon can you get Rafferty on a call? I can try him at 8. Try him now. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She opened her laptop while she waited and pulled up the Hendricks restructuring terms. She read through them one more time, not because she didn't know them, but because she needed her mind fully loaded for what was coming. Every number present, every condition clear, every point of leverage mapped. Marcus called back at 7:19. Rafferty can do a preliminary call at 9. He sounded... Marcus paused. He sounded like he had been expecting to hear from us. He has, she said. Tell him 9. And Marcus, I need you in this building for the rest of today. Don't leave for anything. She used the 90 minutes between 7:19 and 9 o'clock to write. Not the legal pad this time. Her laptop, clean document, structured argument. What she had. What it showed. What it changed about the picture Rafferty was working from. She wrote with the focused velocity of someone for whom thinking and writing were the same action. Pages accumulating with the clean logic of a case being constructed from its foundation up. At 8:51, Marcus Webb arrived. He sat down across from her, looked at what was on her screen, and read for 2 minutes without speaking. This is... he started. I know what it is, she said. Let's make the call. Rafferty picked up on the first ring. His voice had the same measured quality she had clocked the previous afternoon. The careful architecture of a man who did this for a living and had learned to make precision sound like patience. Ms. Vale, he said, I appreciate you reaching out. I need to give you something before we have any formal conversation, she said. I'm going to have my attorney send you a document package in the next 30 minutes. I want you to look at it before we speak again. She kept her voice level. The picture you're currently working from is not the complete picture. A pause. Can you characterize what the package will show? It will show you the financial architecture underneath the one bearing my name, she said. It will show you a capital movement timeline beginning 22 months ago. It will show you an internal authorization pathway designed specifically to route around my visibility. She let a beat go by. And it will show you who built it and who authorized it. The silence on Rafferty's end had the quality of attention, active, recalibrating. Ms. Vale, he said carefully, are you prepared to speak to your own role in the structures, the ones your name is attached to? I am prepared, she said, to explain exactly what I knew, exactly what I was shown, and exactly what I was not shown. She paused. Those are 3 different things. The documentation will clarify which was which. Another pause. I'll look at what you send. The measured voice had shifted very slightly. Not warmth, but a different quality of attention. And we'll speak this afternoon. She ended the call. She looked at Marcus. Send the package. He was already opening his laptop. She stood and walked to the window. 9 floors below, the city was in its full morning state. The dense, purposeful movement of people and vehicles and ordinary consequence. She looked at it for a moment with the feeling of someone standing at the end of a long preparation, all the months of quiet, careful work having built to this morning, this room, this phone call, this package moving through a secure server toward a federal agent's desk. Her phone buzzed on the conference table. She crossed to it. Lucien. Again. She looked at the name and for the first time felt something different about seeing it. Not the compression of suppressed emotion she'd felt for 3 days, not the anger, not even the grief. Just the flat recognition of a name that had once meant something and now meant a problem to be managed. She pressed decline. 20 seconds later, a text from a number she recognized as one of the estate phones. Conference room at the estate. Today, 2 p.m. This is not a request. She read it twice, showed it to Marcus. Do you want to? He started. Yes, she said. I want to go. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who had been in this field long enough to know that walking into a room the Moretti estate had called was not without risk. Serena, I want to be in that room, she said. I want to look at him across that table after everything I found out yesterday. Her voice was even, completely, almost unnervingly even. And I want him to look at me. She picked up the phone. Text back and confirm. Marcus typed, sent. The response was immediate. Be here at 2. They spent the next 3 hours in the conference room. Marcus, Serena, Catherine Hale, who arrived at 10 carrying a full document case, and the expression of a woman who had read Serena's early morning message and understood that today was going to require everything she had. They went through the restructuring agreement. They mapped the conditions. They built the version of the Hendricks authorization that would work for the organization's survival while formally establishing the structural changes Serena required. The independent oversight, the separation of personal expenditure, the documentation of her role that had never been written down because it had never needed to be, because she had always been there to perform it. At 1:15, she left the Harrington building and took a car to the estate. The gates opened without her needing to stop, the same way they had opened when she left on Sunday. Marco was at the main entrance. He held the door. His face did what it almost never did. It showed something, not speech, just a look that lasted 1 second longer than professional neutrality required and said, in the specific language of a man who had worked this door for 12 years, I know what you're walking into. I see you walking into it anyway. She walked through. The main corridor of the estate had the particular quality of a space that had been recently and specifically prepared. Every surface neat, the air carrying the faint traces of the morning's cleaning, the kind of order imposed on a space before something formal occurred in it. She moved through it with the same steady pace she brought to everything. Not fast, not slow, each step deliberate. The conference room door was closed. She opened it. The room had 12 people in it. Lucien sat at the head of the table. He looked, and she registered this with the precise clinical attention she was bringing to every detail today. Like a man who had not slept in 3 days but was performing wakefulness through the force of an ego that would not allow him to appear diminished. His suit was correct. His posture was controlled. But his eyes, when they found her, had the specific quality of something that had been wound extremely tight and was deciding whether to hold or release. Around the table, Caruso, who looked at her with an expression that was two things at once, apology and relief. 3 underbosses whose names she knew and whose organizational positions she knew and whose faces were all carrying the focused attention of men who had read the Sunday letter 3 times and were still processing what it meant. 2 attorneys from the estate's primary legal team. The estate's chief financial officer, a quiet man named Stern, who had always treated Serena with the respectful wariness of someone who understood they were adjacent to a more capable version of their own job. And at the far end of the table, in a chair that had been placed slightly apart from the main grouping, as if the room itself had refused to fully incorporate him, Dominic Reyes. She looked at Reyes for 1 second. He looked back with the compressed stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and was betting on his ability to navigate this one. She sat down. Not at the far end, not at a neutral middle position. 3 chairs from Lucien on the same side of the table, close enough that the conversation between them would happen at a distance that couldn't be made comfortable by space. You came, Lucien said. You asked, she said. He looked at her with the specific look of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and was now adjusting to the version that had actually arrived. She was not the woman he had expected to walk through that door. He had expected something more cracked, more reactive. The woman who had been humiliated at a Sunday lunch and had spent 3 days working from wounded anger. What he saw instead was something composed and cold and completely, utterly present in the way of someone who had finished being surprised. "We need to talk about the authorizations," he said. "We need to talk about several things," she said, "in the order that matters." One of the estate attorneys, Foreman, the senior one, a thin man with the particular bearing of someone paid to be the most careful person in every room, leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Vale, we'd like to address the pending—" "Mr. Foreman," she said, without looking at him, "I'll come to the authorizations. First, I want to address something in front of everyone in this room." She looked at Lucien. "I want to talk about the alternate authorization pathway." The room changed. It was a subtle change, a shift in the way people were sitting, the way the air felt, the specific quality of 12 people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what kind of meeting this was. She watched Reyes in her peripheral vision and saw his hands, which had been flat on the table, move fractionally inward. Lucien's expression did not change. That was his skill, maintaining surface when surface was all that was left. "I don't know what you're—" he started. "6 years ago," she said, 2 months after I was formally brought into the financial coordination role, an internal authorization pathway was created to route capital transfers without my visibility or co-signature. She watched him. "I have the documentation. I have the transfer records. I have the internal authorization codes." She paused. "I have 22 months of capital movement that happened through that pathway while you were telling me the reserve erosion started 14 months ago." The silence that followed had the quality of something irreversible. "That's not—" Lucien started, and she could hear in the fracture of those two words the place where the performance of authority was meeting the reality of no available denial. "7 months ago," she continued, "federal investigators contacted your legal team. They had specific account numbers from the Cyprus positions. You knew the inquiry was active. You knew someone had provided internal information." She kept her voice completely level. "You did not tell me. You allowed me to continue signing documents attached to those accounts. 6 months ago, I signed a renewal authorization on the Cyprus structure." She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has done their last flinching. "While you knew federal investigators were examining it." The room was very quiet. Caruso's hands were clasped in front of him on the table. He was looking at the table's surface. The underbosses were looking at Lucien with the focused attention of men running their own calculations. The specific arithmetic of organizational loyalty meeting the specific arithmetic of legal exposure. "You want to talk about the authorizations," she said. "So do I. Here's what I need you to understand before we go further." She opened the folder she had carried in and placed a single document on the table. A clean one-page summary, the same precision she brought to everything. "The Hendricks refinancing, the downstream agreements, every pending authorization I hold, I will sign all of it." She let that land. "Under conditions that are non-negotiable." Foreman was on his feet. "Ms. Vale, the syndicate cannot accept conditions that—" "Sit down, Mr. Foreman." The voice that came out of her had a quality she had not used in this room before. Not louder, not harder, but with the specific frequency of someone who has stopped accommodating. Foreman sat. She looked at Lucien. "Independent financial oversight," she said. "Formal board structure with external appointees. Full separation of personal expenditure from organizational accounts. Retroactive accounting for the last 22 months. She held his eyes. "Formal, legal, documented recognition of my role in building and maintaining this organization's financial architecture. And Dominic Reyes' resignation from every position he currently holds." The silence after Reyes' name had its own specific texture. Reyes himself went very still in the way of an animal that has understood it has been named. "You're asking me to—" Lucien started. "I'm telling you what happens next," she said, not asking. She picked up the summary page, aligned its edges precisely, set it back down. "Because the alternative, the version where you refuse, where Foreman tries to find a legal mechanism to force the authorizations, where you use the containment attorneys to discredit Cho and discredit me, that version ends with federal investigators in possession of a complete picture of the capital movement timeline, the alternate pathway documentation, and a 22-month accounting of where the money actually went." She paused. "And in that version, your name is on that timeline from the beginning. Mine is not." Lucien's jaw moved. his hands flat on the table, pressed down with a pressure she could see in the white at his knuckle joints. "You would burn it down," he said. Low. The specific low register of a man who is more frightened than angry and is using anger as the more familiar container. "I would survive it," she said. "That's different from burning it down." She met his eyes without breaking. "Whether you survive it depends entirely on what you sign today." The chandelier above the conference room table, the same Venetian crystal from the dining hall, its twin, throwing the same fractured light across the same white surface, made its small sound in the air circulation. Foreman and the second attorney were leaning together, a compressed, urgent conference conducted in the language of professionals who have just had their entire strategy displaced. The underbosses were looking at each other. Caruso was looking at Serena with the expression of a man watching something he has been waiting a long time to see and is not entirely sure how to hold. Stern, the chief financial officer, quiet, careful Stern, who had spent 5 years being respectfully wary of Serena, opened his folder without being asked and turned to the page that contained the Hendricks refinancing structure. Lucian looked at him. Stern said quietly, "She's right about the timeline, Lucian. All of it." He didn't look up from the folder. "I've run the numbers 3 times since last night." He turned a page. "We need her signatures or we don't survive the month." He finally looked up, not at Serena, at Lucian. "And she knows what we know. All of it." A pause. "There's no version of this where we don't give her what she's asking." The room held that. Lucian looked at Serena. 8 years of Sunday lunches and estate dinners and emerald earrings in a safe and a performance of composure practiced in rear-view mirrors. 8 years looked across a conference table at her, and what she saw in his face was not triumph and was not remorse. It was the specific expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time that has been in front of him the whole time, and understanding that clarity has arrived too late to change what it costs. He looked at the document she had placed on the table. His hand moved toward it, and then Foreman said, sharp, urgent, the voice of a man who has just received a message on the phone in his jacket pocket and is trying to decide whether to say what it says, "There's a problem." Everyone looked at him. Foreman set the phone face up on the table. The message on the screen was 4 words from a number Serena recognized as the estate's federal liaison contact. 4 words that landed in the room with the specific weight of something that changes every calculation in every direction simultaneously. Rafferty moved up the timeline. Serena's hand was still on the folder in front of her. Her breathing was steady. Her face was composed. But in her chest, her heart was doing the thing it did when the ground moved. Not panic, but the full-body registration of a situation accelerating past the pace she had planned for. Every variable suddenly in motion at once. The careful sequence she had constructed for the next 18 hours now compressed into something that had to happen in this room, at this table. In the next few, the 4 words on Foreman's phone sat in the middle of the conference table like a detonator with the pin already pulled. Serena read them again. Rafferty moved up the timeline. She understood what it meant before anyone else in the room finished processing it. Rafferty had received the document package from Marcus, the capital movement timeline, the alternate pathway documentation, the 22 months of transfers that the visible architecture had been built to conceal. He had read it, or his team had, quickly enough to understand that the picture had fundamentally changed, and he had decided not to wait for an afternoon conversation. He was moving now, which meant he had something additional, a warrant, a compelled interview, a freezing order on accounts. Or he was moving to prevent the organization from doing anything in the next few hours that would compromise what he was building. Either way, the 18 hours she had planned for had just become something measured in minutes. She looked at Lucian. He was looking at the phone on the table with the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life operating in the space between legal consequence and physical insulation and is now watching that space close from both sides simultaneously. His jaw was set. His hands had come off the table. Something in the set of his shoulders had shifted from the performance of authority into something raw. The actual animal response of a man who is genuinely cornered. "How far out is he?" she said to Foreman. Foreman was texting rapidly. His fingers were not entirely steady. "The contact doesn't know. The message is, it's a warning. Someone in the liaison network flagged it." He looked up. "Could be an hour, could be less." 1 hour. maybe less. She stood up. "I need the room," she said. Everyone except Lucien and Caruso. Nobody moved for 3 seconds, which was the time it took for 12 people to run the calculation of whether they had more to lose by staying or leaving. Then Stern closed his folder and stood, and when Stern stood, the others followed in the way that organizations follow the signal of the person most trusted to read a room correctly. The attorneys exchanged a look, but rose. The underbosses filed out with the compressed quiet of men accustomed to being excluded from conversations they were not ranked to hear. Reyes did not move immediately. She looked at him directly. "You too." He met her eyes for a moment, the specific look of a man deciding whether defiance or capitulation cost more, and then he stood and left. The door closed behind the last person, and the three of them were alone, Serena and Lucien and Caruso. In the room where the Moretti organization had been making decisions for 20 years, she sat back down. Not at her previous position. She moved to the chair directly across from Lucien, the one that put them separated by 3 feet of walnut table and nothing else. "Here is what happens in the next 30 minutes, she said. Her voice was not raised. It had the quality of something that had burned down to its pure form. No performance, no management, no version of itself shaped for the room. You signed the conditions document, all of it, the oversight structure, the expenditure separation, the documentation of my role, Reyes's resignation. You signed the Hendricks authorization under the restructured terms Catherine Hale prepared. And you signed the letter I'm going to draft in the next 10 minutes that establishes my independent status relative to the organization's financial structure, retroactive to the date of Sunday's lunch." Lucien looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not argument, not yet. The thing before argument, when the mind is still deciding which arguments are available. "If you sign those documents before Rafferty arrives," she continued, "I walk into whatever conversation he wants to have with the documentation that shows I was the front, not the architect of the fraud. I walk in with the alternate pathway records and the capital movement timeline and the clear evidentiary picture of what I knew and what I was prevented from knowing." She kept her eyes on his. "That protects you as much as it protects me. Because the story where I was deliberately positioned as the visible structure, while the actual capital movement happened in a pathway I didn't know existed, that story only works if I'm willing to tell it, and I'm only willing to tell it if those documents are signed." Lucien was quiet. "And if I don't sign," he said. Low, not a challenge, almost genuinely a question, the question of a man who needs to hear the full picture before he can move. "Then I tell Rafferty everything," she said, "the complete version, including the part where your legal team was informed 7 months ago and chose to leave me on the accounts as legal exposure management." She didn't blink. "I have Marcus Webb's documentation on that, dated correspondence." She paused. "You survived the organization losing me. You do not survive what I know about the last 22 months if I decide it's not worth protecting." The chandelier above them moved fractionally in the air circulation. The crystal made its small sound. Caruso, who had been sitting at the far end of the table with his hands clasped and his eyes moving between them like a man watching a detonation sequence he cannot stop, said quietly, "Lucien, sign the documents." Lucien looked at him. "She built it," Caruso said. Just that. 3 words with the weight of everything that hadn't been said for 8 years. She built it, and you know it, and everyone in this organization has always known it, even when we pretended we didn't. His voice was not accusatory. It was tired in the way of a man who has been carrying a dishonesty for a long time and has finally set it down. Sign the documents. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the quality of light in the room seemed to shift. The fractured chandelier light moving imperceptibly as the afternoon outside changed. Lucien looked at the conditions document on the table. He picked up the pen. She watched his hand move. Watched him sign the first document with the controlled, steady pen stroke of a man who had made his decision and was not going to perform hesitation once the decision was made. He moved through the pages with the same controlled pace. The Hendricks restructuring, the expenditure separation agreement, the independent oversight charter, the formal documentation of her role, strategic financial director, retroactive to the beginning of her involvement, a title that had existed in practice for 8 years without ever existing on paper. He reached the last document, the one establishing her independent status, her separation from the organizational structure, her freedom from any claim the estate might make on her professional activities going forward. He held the pen above it for 3 seconds. She watched those 3 seconds the way you watch something that has been a long time coming. He signed. She took the documents, aligned the pages, placed them in her folder with the same precision she brought to everything, every page accounted for, every signature on the correct line. "Reyes," she said, standing, "his resignation is effective today. I want the written notice in Marcus's hands before I leave this building." Lucien said nothing, but he reached for his phone. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back once. She looked at Lucien, really looked at him, the full look she had been keeping compressed since Sunday, the one that contained 8 years of Sundays and emerald earrings in a safe, and rear-view mirrors and legal pads, and the particular exhaustion of building something extraordinary for someone who never once thought to look at who was doing the building. She had thought she would feel something specific in this moment. She had anticipated it might be grief, or the last gasp of whatever love had lived in the architecture of those years, or even a version of triumph that tasted like something other than ash. What she felt instead was simpler. She felt finished, not destroyed, not emptied. The specific, clean, honest sensation of a chapter that has reached its last page, the weight of it resolved into something that could be set on a shelf and walked away from. "I hope the organization survives," she said. And she meant it, because she was not a woman who wished destruction on people even when they had earned it, because destruction was a low ambition, and she had always aimed higher than that. "I genuinely do." She left the conference room. In the hallway, she called Marcus. "The documents are signed. I'll have them to you in 40 minutes. Clear the afternoon. Rafferty will be in contact, and I want you on every call." She was at the front entrance when Marco held the door for her again. This time his face did not almost show something. It showed it fully. The specific expression of a man who had watched a long story reach the ending it deserved. "Miss Vale," he said. She stopped, looked at him. "Thank you, Marco," she said, "for all the doors." He nodded once, with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what that meant. She walked out into the afternoon. The next 4 hours had the compressed, relentless quality of a sequence that has been building for a long time and is finally allowed to move. She met with Rafferty in Marcus's conference room at 4:15, not the voluntary conversation of the previous day's invitation, but a formal interview. Rafferty in person, with a junior agent and a recording device, and the specific manner of a federal investigator who has received new documentation that has substantially changed his understanding of a case. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with the kind of face that expressed very little and absorbed everything. The professional blankness of someone who had learned to make himself into a neutral surface so that other people's reactions remained uncontaminated by his own. She told him the complete version, not everything. She was not reckless, and Marcus was present, and there were limits to what she could say without implicating herself in things that the documentation did not already clarify. But the structural truth, what she had built, what she had known, what she had been prevented from knowing, the alternate pathway, the capital movement timeline, the 7 months in which she had been kept on compromised accounts, while the estate's legal team managed around her exposure rather than protecting her from it. Reyes's role, the documented sequence of transfers. She did not editorialize. She did not perform emotion. She told Rafferty what she knew with the precision of someone who has spent 8 years doing exactly this, organizing complex information into the clearest possible structure for the person across the table. Rafferty listened. His junior agent took notes. The recorder ran. At the end, Rafferty looked at her for a moment, the first time his face had moved into anything resembling a personal register, and said, "You've been holding this organization together for 8 years." "Yes, she said. "And you didn't know the pathway existed." "No," she said. "I didn't." He looked at his notes. "The documentation you've provided, the Cho analysis, the web correspondence, this is going to take time to fully process. I want to be honest with you about the timeline." "I understand timelines," she said. He almost smiled. "I believe you do." He closed his folder. "You'll hear from my office within 72 hours. In the meantime," he looked at her steadily, "don't leave the country." "I wasn't planning to," she said. She left Marcus's building at 6:40. The city was in its early evening state. The sky, the deep blue of late winter, the streets shifting from commuter traffic to the different energy of the evening, the lights coming on in the towers around her one by one. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment outside the building and breathed the cold air and let the day settle on her shoulders, the way weight settles when you've been carrying it for a long time and have finally stopped moving. She called Dara. "Go home," she said. "Take tomorrow morning. Come in at noon." "Is everything—" "Everything is in motion," she said, "which is different from everything being fine, but it's enough for tonight." She walked to a diner 3 blocks from the Harrington, a place she had been going to for 4 years on the occasional evening when she didn't want to eat alone in her apartment, but also didn't want the performance of a restaurant. Counter seating, good coffee, a burger she had ordered enough times that the woman behind the counter started on it when she saw Serena come through the door. She sat at the counter, ate, drank her coffee, read nothing, looked at nothing in particular, let her mind be quiet in the specific way it could only be quiet when it had finished what it had set out to do. She thought about the signed documents in her folder, the folder that was now in Marcus's office, scanned, copied, distributed to 3 separate secure locations. The habit of a woman who understood that a document that existed in only one place was a document that could disappear. She thought about Daniel Cho, who had texted at 5:47, a single line, "I heard. Thank you." She had not yet responded. She would. She thought Cho was probably a person worth knowing, the kind of person who spent 18 months carrying documentation no one wanted to look at because he had decided the truth was worth the cost of carrying it. She had some sympathy for that position. She thought briefly about Vivian Cross. She thought about her with the same absence of specific feelings she had felt since Sunday. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, just the flat recognition that Vivian Cross was a person who had walked into a burning building and would have to find her own way out of it. That was not Serena's to fix or to mourn. She finished the coffee, paid, left a tip she always left. She walked home in the dark. Over the next 3 weeks, the sequence played out with the particular combination of speed and slowness that legal and financial processes always produced. Bursts of urgent activity followed by periods of grinding, documented procedure. Rafferty's office issued a series of document requests to the Moretti organization's legal team. The alternate pathway transfers became the center of an expanded investigation. Dominic Reyes was formally interviewed and subsequently disappeared from the organizational chart with the speed of a man who had been given a choice and made it. The Hendricks refinancing closed under the restructured terms. The construction subsidiary did not default. The legitimate business portfolio continued operating, restaurants, real estate, construction, under the new independent oversight structure, which was chaired by an external financial consultant whose appointment Serena had specified and Marcus had documented. The Moretti syndicate survived. Diminished, reconfigured, operating under a set of conditions that would make the kind of unchecked personal expenditure of the previous 22 months impossible to repeat without triggering an immediate review. It was not the empire it had been. Empires rarely survive the removal of their actual foundations and remain the same shape afterward. Lucien remained its operational head. There were no criminal charges against him in the first review period. The documentation established Reyes as the primary facilitator of the concealment, and Lucien's attorneys were skilled, and the case was complex, and complexity was the environment in which such attorneys thrived. He was not untouched. He was not the untouchable king he had been. Every senior associate in the organization now understood, with the clarity that could not be unknowed, that the man at the head of the table had been carried for 8 years by the woman who was no longer at it. That knowledge had a specific weight in a room. It didn't need to be spoken to be present. Serena moved into this penthouse on the 14th of April, a high-floor apartment in a building on the east side that she had looked at once, briefly, 2 years ago, during a period when she had allowed herself the private act of imagining a life that belonged only to her before folding that imagining back up and returning to the life she was actually living. The apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the city skyline. She had bought almost no furniture yet, and in the first week she lived in the specific austere spaciousness of a place that had not yet accumulated the sediment of habitation, every room clean and possible. She stood at the window on her first morning there with her coffee and looked at the city below and felt the particular quality of a space that was entirely, uncomplicatedly hers. No one would walk into this space and place another person in her chair. No one would conduct financial maneuvers around her visibility while she continued signing documents in good faith. No one would spend 8 years watching her carry something and fail to notice the carrying because the results arrived so smoothly that they seemed to come from nowhere. She registered that she was alone and felt distinctly that alone and lonely were not the same room. She launched the firm on the 1st of May under her own name, Serena Vale Financial Consulting. Not elegant as a name, she acknowledged that, but accurate. And she had spent enough years operating under language that obscured rather than clarified to want her own work to be precisely what it said it was. The office was 4 rooms on the 20th floor of a building in the financial district, staffed by Dara and 3 people Serena had recruited specifically, each of them chosen for the quality she most valued in a professional context: the capacity to look at what was actually there rather than what was most comfortable to see. Her first client was a mid-sized manufacturing company whose financial structure had been accumulating quiet vulnerabilities for several years, the kind of vulnerabilities that were invisible to people who wanted them to be invisible and entirely legible to someone who knew what to look for. She spent 3 weeks mapping the exposure, another 2 developing the restructuring plan, and presented the completed analysis in a conference room full of executives who sat with the particular expression of people being shown something they had been very successfully not seeing. At the end of the presentation, the company's CEO, a heavy-set man in his 60s who had built the company from nothing and possessed the combination of intelligence and pride that sometimes made intelligence expensive, looked at her across the table with the expression of someone taking accurate measure for the first time. "How did we miss all of this?" he asked. "You didn't miss it," she said. "You managed it. There's a difference. You built structures that let you not look at it directly." She closed her presentation folder. "I can show you how to look at it directly. That's what I do." He hired her the next day. She signed the contract on a Tuesday morning at her desk, with the city visible through the window behind her and the office quiet around her and Dara moving efficiently in the outer room. And she held the pen after signing for a moment before she set it down because she wanted to feel the weight of it. Not the pen, but the act. The act of signing her own name on her own contract for her own work, in an office that bore her name on the door, in a city where she had spent 8 years being essential to something that had spent 8 years pretending she was incidental. She felt the weight of it. Then she set the pen down and moved to the next item on her desk. In the weeks that followed, Elena Caruso called once. Not Vincent, Elena. They met for coffee at a place in Midtown that was neutral ground, and Elena sat across from her with the directness of a woman who had decided that the social courtesies of their shared world were no longer the most useful tool for this particular conversation. "Are you all right?" Elena asked. Not as preface, as the actual question. "Yes," Serena said, and meant it with the specific texture of an honest yes rather than a managed one. "I'm all right." Elena looked at her for a moment with the eyes of someone who had been in this world for 30 years and had developed a precise instrument for detecting the difference between a person who was surviving and a person who was genuinely all right. "Good," she said. "That's the thing I needed to know." She picked up her coffee. The rest of it. The organization, Lucien, all of it. She waved a hand that made 30 years of complexity into a single dismissible gesture. "That'll be what it'll be. It always is." She looked at Serena over the rim of her cup. "But you needed to be all right." Serena looked back at her with a warmth she allowed herself fully, without managing it. "Thank you for calling. Sunday night. You didn't have to." "I've been in rooms where women got replaced," Elena said simply. "I know what it looks like when the wrong person is humiliated." She set her cup down. "I wanted you to know someone saw it correctly." They talked for another hour. Not about the organization, not about Lucien, not about anything that required the particular carefulness of that world. They talked about the city in spring, about Elena's daughter who was finishing a graduate program, about a restaurant on the west side that Elena insisted was the best Italian food north of 42nd Street. Ordinary, human conversation conducted between 2 women on a Tuesday afternoon in April, the kind of conversation that required nothing from either of them except presence. It was, Serena thought, one of the finest hours she had spent in recent memory. She walked back to her office through the spring afternoon, the air having finally shifted from March's gray cold into something that held the genuine suggestion of warmth, The city's trees in the early stages of their annual optimism, the light at a different angle than it had been all winter. She thought about the last 4 months in the aggregate, the Sunday lunch, the envelope, the conference rooms, Rafferty's careful voice, the folder of documents that had changed what was possible and what was not possible, the signed pages in Marcus's files, the penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the 4 rooms with her name on the door. She had not come through it undamaged. She understood that with clear eyes. There were things in the architecture of those 8 years, trust in certain varieties of human behavior, an uncomplicated relationship with her own competence, the particular ease that came from believing you were known by the person you had chosen, that had been broken in ways that would take longer than 4 months to rebuild. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was standing in the spring afternoon walking back to her own office, and the walk was hers, and the office was hers, and the work was hers. And whatever she built from this point forward would bear her name because she had put it there, not because she had been allowed to. She stopped at a crosswalk. The light was red. Around her, the ordinary current of people and vehicles and the city's indifferent ongoing life. She thought one last time about Lucien Moretti. Not with anger, not with grief, with the specific final clarity of someone looking at a chapter that is genuinely closed. He was not a villain. She had spent time trying to make him one in the private accounting of the sleepless hours, because villains were cleaner than the truth. The truth was more complicated and in some ways worse. He was a man of considerable capability who had built something significant and had surrounded himself with the one person capable of sustaining it without ever fully comprehending what that person was. He had looked at 8 years of extraordinary work and seen the results without seeing the labor, because the labor was conducted with a discipline that made it invisible, and he had taken the invisibility for absence. He had loved her in the way that people love things they cannot fully see, and he had replaced her in front of 30 people because he could not afford, psychologically, to examine what she was, because examining it fully would have required him to examine himself, and there were men who would burn an empire before they submitted to that examination. She had spent 8 years being careful around that truth. She was done being careful around it. The light changed. She crossed. At her desk 20 minutes later, she opened a new document on her laptop. Clean page, cursor blinking. The second major client engagement was coming. A referral from the manufacturing company's CEO. A larger and more complex situation. The kind of work that would require everything she had and would take 6 months minimum and would matter. She began to type. The office was quiet around her. Through the window, the city held its afternoon shape, the towers and the light, and the particular density of a place where 10,000 things were happening simultaneously, none of them waiting for anyone. She typed without stopping for a long time, the cursor moving steadily across the clean page, building something from the beginning with full knowledge of what she was building and why, with her name on the door and her name on the document, and no one in the room but herself and the work. The pen she had held in the Moretti Estates conference room, signing her own freedom with the same controlled pen stroke she had used to sign 8 years of someone else's survival. That pen was in her desk drawer now, one drawer down. She had not thrown it away. Not as a memento, not as a reminder of injury. She had kept it as the specific physical evidence of something she intended never to forget. That she was capable of sitting across from the person who had used her most completely, in the room where she had been most invisible, and speaking with such clarity and precision that the room could not look away. She had done that. Whatever else this city and this work and this life brought to the clean page of what came next, she had done that. She typed another line. Outside, the afternoon light moved through its slow arc over the skyline, the shadows of the towers lengthening across the streets below, the city shifting into its evening register the way it always did. Indifferent, continuous, full of 10,000 stories running simultaneously with no knowledge of each other. Hers was one of them, running now on its own power, in its own direction, under its own name. She kept writing until the light outside her window was gone, and the city had become its other self, all illuminated glass and the particular clarity of the dark. And when she finally stopped, it was not because she had run out of things to say, but because the first day's work was done, and tomorrow's would begin at 7. And she had learned, in the long discipline of the last 8 years, that a person who wanted to build something that lasted had to know when to put down the pen. She saved the document. She put on her coat. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked out into the city she had decided belonged, now, entirely to her.